and a government was not yet established, cabinet was not formed, a commissioner of police was not appointed, a chief of defense was not appointed, a defense minister, a home minister was not appointed, and the rest of the government was still being discussed and decided upon. So there was only one person, the president alone, who was appointed just less than 24 hours after. I mean to say, there was only the president who was in command, and there was no structure, no established government at the time. And the assembly that took place, the group of people, the huge number of people who came, were all belonging to one party, who were clearly agitated and unhappy with the sudden change of government and the sudden termination of their own government and their leader. So naturally, violence was expected and vengeance was expected. Spiteful remarks were heard, and people had to be prepared for that. Had that not been stopped in some form, I'm sure the country would have descended into a much more chaotic situation than what we witnessed. All that said, I would still expect our police to be more professional, our defense forces to be more professional. They should not consider them as ordinary members, ordinary men and women of the public. They are trained people, they are a professional organization, and despite the fact that they have been subjected to three weeks of continuous hardship, extreme pressure, constant alert, exhaustion, tiredness, all had set in, and the government has been changed. All that understood, still, as a citizen of this country, I would have expected them to be less forceful and more professional. And all that said, in fairness to both sides involved in the confrontation, I would think that there would come a time we would learn from these incidents. There have to be lessons that we need to learn from these incidents of yesterday, and there have to be a proper investigation of actually what transpired, and there must be due process followed, so that respect for the institution, respect for the processes, respect for rule of law is appreciated by all alike.
The president, former President Mohammad Nasheed, he said after resigning, especially in interviews to international media, he said that he was forced to resign on gunpoint. Do you think there is any truth to it, or do you think it is just an attempt by the NDP administration to try and convince people that the Wahid administration is a fraud?
Well, I don't think it should be taken literally. I think what he's saying probably is that he was subjected to pressure and he was under duress and he had no other choice. But I'm not an insider. I'm not a member of a government. I'm just a private citizen who was just like any other person watching these events unfold. And I happened to be there at ground zero when this happened. And like any other person who was watching it on television, like any other person who was getting information from the media, getting information from people who were, in the scene or in departments or in responsible positions, what I had understood throughout, or what I understand even now, is that this is not just an isolated event, and it should not be considered as an isolated event. It should be understood as a cumulative response to an episode that ran for 3 weeks. The pressure has been building from the moment of the arrest of the judge, the criminal court judge. It was clearly in violation of the Constitution, in breach of our laws. Many lawyers have said it. Every court in this land had said it. And there's no justification for that continued detention or military detention of a criminal court judge. That went into 3 weeks. There had been nightly protests organized calling for his release, and for the government to get inside the Constitution, to return to the Constitution once again, restore the fundamental liberties of that judge and allow him access to justice. These had been the calls that had been reverberating for the entire 3 weeks. While these protests were going on, both the defense forces and the Maldives police force, they were all subjected to controlling the crowds, an alert status, and all the while knowing that this was totally unnecessary and that all of that could have been avoided. The last of the protests that happened really erupted in violence. The police were there. They were acting as a buffer between two protesting parties, one organizing a counter-protest to the other nightly protests that was happening. They were acting as the wall that kept the two parties separate. They were asked to go. The two parties engaged in violence. They were crushed by MNDF shortly afterwards. And the police force had started walking, the battalion or the troops that were there, the police members of the police force who were there to man these two parties protesting against each other, they had walked from there to the Independence Square. Their protest was one of disgust and disbelief, and they were just tired of doing this every night. And it started like that. They were there the entire night, and MNDF had cordoned them off, and there were attempts to dissolve the protest. It didn't happen. It grew by the numbers, and in the wee hours of morning you had seen both the police and MNDF engaging with each other also, twice I'm told, on two occasions, each throwing gas canisters at one another, engaging in fights. This was not expected, and there came a time that everything broke down. And I think it was at that moment that the president came, spoke to them, couldn't win his side of the argument. He was asking them to hand them over to military custody. They were considered as police who were engaged in a mutiny against the president, and therefore they should be arrested by the military or taken into custody by the military. The police didn't accept that. MNDF didn't want to get engaged in that, get involved in it. And finally, when the president was inside consulting with the people, he finally wanted to consult with the troops, MNDF themselves. And he was asking a simple question: what should I do? And the only reply he got from the rank and file, not the superior officers, was that he should go, he should resign. I think that was the moment that the president realized that he had lost the allegiance of his forces. It was not a rebellion, it was not a mutiny, it was not a overthrow of a government, it was not a coup. It was just that the forces had gotten so tired and exhausted following unconstitutional orders. They finally drew the line and said, enough is enough. We do not have our allegiance to you anymore. You should go home.
Like you said, it seemed like a peaceful transfer of power at the time, and when the president gave his resignation announcement, it seemed like he was resigning voluntarily. But later on, just 24 hours after that, his statement changed. What do you think caused this change?
I think the resignation, the act of announcement and the act of sending that letter are all voluntary. He's claiming that it was done despite being voluntary. The act was committed under duress, and therefore he doesn't believe it was a legitimate resignation. But that argument, as I said, when checked against the facts, the entire set of facts and circumstances that happened from the night before to the morning to the moment of resignation towards noon or close to 1 p.m., that all of them combined together gave him no choice but to resign and go, so that there would be no bloodshed in this country, that the country would not descend into more chaos. Already he was certain when he asked the troops what he should do, and when the troops told him that you should go home, you should resign, he understood that he had lost it, that he had blown the chance, and that he could not survive as president when the police and the MNDF were not behind him in full loyalty. He knew that, and he consulted with many.